For joining us this afternoon for our December State Office webinar. This is also our wrap up for the 2024 invasives theme for the EMG program. Our webinar series is intended to provide ideas and education for current VCE Master Gardeners. As a reminder, a recording of this session and any resources will be posted on our website underneath the webinars tab. We will have another webinar in late December on invasive stream biology and ecology by Gabrielle Ripa. There's information on the internet about that. This afternoon, we have Jacob Barney from the Invasive Species Collaborative here at Tech. I'm going to let him introduce himself, and I'm going to ask that you hold your questions until the end or type them in the chat or do whatever form of interaction that Dr. Barney asks you to through the presentation. And Dr. Barney, if you want to share your screen and start presenting, it's 2:01. It's my fastest introduction ever.
All right, thanks, Grace. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Let's see. I assume everybody's good. Okay, cool. All right, so thanks for the opportunity to chat with you all this afternoon. My name is Jacob Barney. I'm a professor in the School of Plant Environmental Sciences and also the director of the Invasive Species Collaborative here on campus. And I'll say more about that later. I've been here since 2010, and I'm an invasive plant ecologist and have been working on invasive plants for well over 25 years. And I teach a class here on campus about invasive species. And today I'm just going to give you a really broad overview of invasive species, not just plants, but a variety of species and their impacts, and then leave you plenty of opportunities to ask questions at the end. And I would love some interaction on the chat. I've got the chat open. I sort of much prefer doing things in person, so we'll try to make this as interactive as possible through our Zoom technologies. This is like the bad old days from the pandemic when I had to teach from my basement. Anyway, okay, let's see. Okay, so first off, we have to start with some definitions, and this seems maybe a little bit rudimentary, but it's actually important that we all sort of start on the same page in thinking about what an invasive species is. And I brought this definition from the 1999 executive order, which gave invasive species a formal policy definition for the United States. And it's basically any species that's been moved to a new ecosystem that's not previously native to, and the introduction of that species causes some sort of harm. And there is something that's missing from that definition, and that's that humans have moved that species. And this is an important consideration, especially in the age of climate change, where things are going to be shifting around quite a bit in response to climate change. So we can come back to that later on, but thinking, again, humans have to be directly or indirectly involved in the movement of these species. Okay, and this is where if we were in person, I'd give some pop quizzes here, because I think it's interesting to start with like how many species we're actually talking about. And I want you to guess the total number of plant species in the United States that include our native and our introduced plant species. So just throw out in the chat the numbers that you think might be. Are we talking hundreds? Are we talking millions? Again, this is the number of native and introduced species in the US. All right, I see some guesses coming in. 100,000, few thousand, 2 million. All right, what else? 35 million, 1,000. All right, so we're a little bit all over the place. We range several orders of magnitude here. So lots of variation. Now, relative to the plants, do we think there's more or fewer vertebrate species? So we're talking mammals, birds, reptiles, fish. You know, are there more or less? Okay, yeah, less vertebrates, fewer, less. Okay. Fewer lots of people saying less verts. Okay. Now, what about the arthropods? And I like to give my entomologist colleagues some a hard time here because they get their own department, and the rest of us plant people, we're spread out all over the place. So do you think there's more insects than there are others? And they get their whole department. Yeah, probably more. Okay, so here's our numbers. There's about 20,000 plants. So we were all over the place guessing. But you were right, most of you. There's way fewer vertebrate species and a whole lot more arthropods. And so that's sort of general idea is the number of species we have, but you may be surprised to learn what proportion of those are introduced. And it's actually uh, a lot higher than a lot of people anticipate. Now, this is not the number of invasive species, and is there an important distinction between what's considered invasive and what's been introduced. So this is simply the number of species that have been introduced to the United States, and a lot of these are, some of the plants and insects. They're more or less estimates, but um, again, we have a pretty significant portion of species in the U.S. already that have been introduced. And some of these you're well aware of, the sort of classic kudzu, the vine that ate the South, which has a sordid history as being intentionally introduced and then spread by the millions by the federal government for good reasons, of course. But this is one you're all familiar with. Tree of Heaven, this is, again, probably one of the most common introduced trees in the world. As you can see from this picture I took in Baltimore, this thing requires no soil to grow, can grow pretty much anywhere. So it's very tolerant of growing in man-made conditions. And of course, really became most famous when this guy showed up and we realized that the spotted lanternfly uses Atlantis as a sort of preferred host. Now, spotted lanternfly can um, survive on lots of different species, but it does seem that tree of heaven is a preferred host, which has renewed interest in this species. And we have feral hogs. This is probably one of the most damaging invasive species in the state. There's a lot of work at the state level on managing this species, and you can see the kind of damage that it causes. Sorry, in the background there, that's a sort of rutting in a homeowner's yard, and this causes all kinds of problems. Yeah, so that's a common sight. And then we've got some of these really interesting species like snakehead fish, which are in most of the freshwater rivers in eastern Virginia. And this species is interesting because it was likely introduced on purpose. It's a predator fish, and it has the unique ability of being able to breathe air and walk on land, which is pretty incredible, actually. So I haven't seen this species in person, but this is one that is of great concern in the eastern part of the state. But the number of again, established introduced species across the world is really high. And there's obviously huge geographic variation there. There are established introduced species even in Antarctica now. There's some grasses that have established there, as well as some marine species. So there's really no place on Earth that is immune from invasion, and there's lots of aquatic examples, etc. Now, on that chart on the right, you can see that the number of species establishing continues to increase. But again, what proportion of these are actually invasive? And this question was recently answered in a really comprehensive synthetic way. I want to bring this to your attention because if you didn't see this when it came out, this was published about a year ago now. This is the IPBES report on invasive species, which you can think about it as being the invasive species equivalent of the climate change report that the IPCC puts out every so often. And this was the very first comprehensive global report on the status of invasive species across the entire world. And I'm going to share some statistics from this, but this allowed us to have a really comprehensive viewpoint as to where these species are, what impacts they're having, how many there are, et cetera. And I want to share some of the definitions they have here because I think it really is important to parse out some of these. And the sort of lexicon of invasion has been confusing for a long time. And when I ask my students to define invasive species versus native species, they often struggle a little bit more with native species, ironically. And these are the sort of accepted definitions now. The native species is any organism that still remains within its natural range, including ones that's shifting without human involvement. Okay, and again, we'll come back to the human involvement later on. An introduced species is one that has been moved beyond some sort of natural barrier. Again, we've moved it. We often think about these as moving across oceans or mountain ranges, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that. But again, thinking about moving continents. And then a very minor modification of that is now that species has become established, and that's what the general community considers something that's a non-native species, and that's often a very high number. But at that point, it's really not causing any sort of noticeable harm. And that's when you get to an invasive species. So now this is a species that's been moved beyond its native range through human action and is known to be causing some negative impact to either biodiversity, ecosystems, the economy, or human well-being. And this process is called biological invasions. So again, I'm going to be mostly focusing on invasive species, those that are known to have caused some sort of negative impact. And I would highly recommend you check out that IPBES report. There's a really nice executive summary. They have a really nice website with good graphics to sort of share with you some of the sort of summary findings of this analysis. And I was really lucky to be part of this as well. Okay, so let's talk about some of the impacts here and why we care about these species and sort of thinking about it from a high level. Again, they're super costly. The numbers that we have were recently updated as to the consequences to the U.S. economy, putting it at $21 billion. I think everyone agrees this is a gross underestimate. It's really a summary of the known statistics we have on the consequences of these species on the economy. But again, consider this an extremely conservative estimate. The global estimate is $500 billion or so. So, like when talking to policymakers or regulators, it's always good to bring in monies just to have a sense because everybody understands economics. They remain the second greatest threat to native biodiversity, second only to us, humans, through our habitat destruction. And I'll come back to that later. They are reshaping how many ecosystems change. And we got some new information on their role in extinction. So again, that's sort of the worst case scenario. This is a graphic from that IPBES report showing the annual cost estimates over time. And then the graph on the right is a nice summary showing that not all introduced species have negative impacts. You can see there's a positive bars on top, but what it should be clear is that the negative impacts far outweigh any positive benefits. And sometimes this depends on who the stakeholder is or your viewpoint on a particular species. Feral hogs is an example that was intentionally introduced for a while for hunting purposes, and so there's some economics involved in that. But in general, their negative impacts far outweigh their benefits. So again, these are species that are inarguably having negative impacts on this ecosystem. And their impacts can be a wide variety of situations. So here's tamarisk in the Colorado River out west, which is displacing all of the native willows and actually has a higher evapotranspiration rate, which is increasing the salinity on these riverbanks, which is also decreasing the freshwater availability to the cities and farms that rely on the Colorado River. That's actually a waterway that's covered by an aquatic plant, and these are some of the most damaging invasive species because they're so challenging to remove once they've been introduced. I think this, we've got kudzu growing on infrastructure. This is a common sight in our neck of the woods. And I just give a brief mention to this species. This is the brown tree snake, which we have a faculty member here on campus who works on in Guam, which was unintentionally introduced following World War II. They think through, air cargo as we were removing our military supplies following the war, and either a pregnant female or a couple escaped, and they have since eaten every single bird and almost every reptile on the island of Guam. Sort of devastating ecological impacts when a predator is introduced to a place that never had predators before. The birds had no natural fear of this snake. So that's sort of a worst case scenario. There's also implications now to threats to national security, and this is one that is in the news all the time, but not necessarily the invasive species role in it. The light green area in this picture is giant reed, which is an introduced species that was intentionally planted in the riverbanks for a long time to stabilize the stream banks and the riverbanks, but has since grown completely out of control. And the issue on the border, that picture's in the Rio Grande between Mexico and Texas, is that there's a picture of me and my students holding one of the canes of this grass. You can imagine how easy it would be to hide in that. So Customs and Border Patrol is actually seeking some biological control solutions to this species as a means of protecting and dealing with immigration challenges. So it affects all manner of society. Something that has come into stark relief lately is the role that invasive plants play in fire cycles. And this is one that we've known about in the Great Basin in the West for a long time, less so here in the East, but it does happen, where cheatgrass and other species have invaded these ecosystems, which are fire adapted, but these invasive grasses have displaced the native perennial species, and now they accumulate larger fuel loads, they burn hotter, they burn faster, and they burn more frequently. So it's creating this feedback loop because the native species are intolerant of this fire cycle. And so the invasive grasses are actually shifting the entire way that these places burn. And as you'll recall, the Maui wildfire about a year ago, where over 100 people died, was directly attributable to invasive grasses in Maui. Once the sugarcane plantations were abandoned, invasive grasses took their place. The power line fell in this, and it lit up and spread like crazy. So, and this is again also happening out west, where there's now direct evidence that this is contributing to increased fire cycles. I love this photo because it looks like from a zombie apocalypse film of kudzu overtaking an amusement park once it's been abandoned. That's not AI, that's real life. And this is, if you've ever read the book, The World Without Us, the first thing that takes over infrastructure are the weeds. And this is the kind of impact that if we're not constantly managing these species to keep them in check, the kind of impact that they could have. And one of my favorite examples of this is in the UK, where Japanese knotweed is considered like public enemy number one. And it is actually illegal to have on your property. And you're not allowed to sell your property or get a mortgage until you've demonstrated you do not have this species on your property. And you can see the photos on the right there of it growing through infrastructure. We have this plant here, but not nearly to the level that they have it there or in the northeastern part of the US. And this is just a news article about this guy who couldn't sell his house. But I love this picture. It's like home invasion, right? It's like the plant invasive weed version of a home invasion, literally growing through the floorboards of this person's home. Pretty incredible. And of course, the place that we've been managing these unwanted species for literally thousands of years is in agriculture. And the threat that weeds and other species present to agricultural productivity is profound. And while the entomologists get their own department, their fraction of their threats to agriculture is actually smaller. Just saying, the weeds have a larger role in threatening agriculture, which has resulted in a massive application of herbicides and pesticides annually, which has unfortunately led to an absolute massive increase in the number of herbicide-resistant weeds, which is actually reshaping agriculture in a pretty profound way, where we're having to go back to hand weeding or tilling or using less safe, let's say, less safe herbicides in places that are more risky. And so this is a big deal for weed scientists and farmers dealing with herbicide resistance. And we certainly have that here in Virginia. So something a lot of us can relate to, and something I think a lot of people are thinking about more lately, is the role of pollinators in our landscapes. And this is in the news occasionally, but there was a really interesting study published a few years ago showing the relationship between our garden plants in our homes and the fledgling and performance behavior of native birds. And so what the graphs there are showing you is on the top right there is the proportion of species in suburban homes that are non-native, which a lot of our cultivated plants are, that the availability of prey, of spiders, caterpillars, and other things that birds eat, actually declines precipitously the more introduced or non-native garden plants we have in our landscape beds, which has a direct relationship with the reproductive potential and fitness of our native birds. And I think this is really nice evidence to show that the things that we plant in our yards does have impacts on the local ecology, and just increasing the amount of native plants by 10-20% in the landscape can have really important benefits to the insects that live in these communities, and also the birds that a lot of us care about. And so it's to sort of bring it back home, there's the kind of actions that we can take and the things that we plant in our yards. And sometimes invasive plants can have really interesting, complicated consequences to our food webs. And I just want to give you one example of a plant species that most of us are familiar with, Japanese stilt grass, which is one of the most common invasive species in our forests. And it's been shown that it has a whole bunch of ecological impacts, but one of them is it sort of adds a new layer to the forest understory. And, a lot of our forests don't have a dominant understory. And this grass comes in, blankets the forest floor, which increases habitat complexity, which is a benefit to some of the predatory spiders. So there's new habitat there. Simultaneously, it decreases the habitat for some of our invertebrate insects, both of which are having negative impacts to our native amphibian species. So the amphibians have less to eat, and there's higher predation from spiders in these systems. So that's not an obvious impact that stiltgrass may be having. We know it impacts tree recruitment, et cetera. But here's an example showing a multi-trophic interaction from a plant invasion. And sometimes these plants can have uh, implications for human health. And this is something I think we're just starting to peel back this sort of the veil on, and so what these interactions look like. So I'm showing you a picture here of Japanese barberry, one of the most common shrubby species available. The picture in the background is from the northeastern US, where it's super common. The inset picture is from Pandapus Pond here locally. When I moved to Blacksburg, the first thing I did was pull this stupid plant out of my yard when I moved here. But the implications are that when it escapes into areas like I'm showing you in the background, it actually increases tick habitat, which has had a direct relationship to an increase in the incidence of Lyme disease. So again, this is a multi-trophic interaction. There's more ticks, there's a higher deer population, and both of those are interacting more with humans. And so the incidence of Lyme disease has increased. And, this is only happening because of the escape of this plant species. And, for those of you who have been on campus, you probably recognize this plant as the foundation of our logos that we here have on campus, but over by the baseball field and by Torg Bridge. But I'm happy to report after 10 years, I have got the landscape architect, head of facilities, the president, everybody on board that we are researching on replacing this Japanese barberry with native alternatives. I'm pretty excited about that. So stay tuned that eventually one day these two logos will be native species. I'm really excited about that. And I think, the university is investing a lot in invasive species research. And so let's put it out in front in our logo. And so stay tuned for that. So sort of one of the worst case scenarios here that we didn't have a lot of information on until this IPBES report came out is the role that invasive species are playing in extinctions. And this doesn't necessarily mean the wholesale loss of species. It can mean local extinctions. So, places that, islands or other places that these species exist. But invasive species in general are now known to be responsible for greater than 60% of all extinctions in the modern era, which is profound. We had no idea it was that high. And it's not all just from predators. There are circumstances with introduced plants and invasive plants causing these sort of problems. And so this is something we're just beginning to understand. But again, this is the worst case scenario here. Okay, I wanted to give you a few examples of some of the other impacts that some species that are common to our neck of the woods might be causing. And I showed you Japanese stiltgrass earlier and how it's impacting amphibian habitat and productivity. But something that some grad students and I were interested in is a broader role of the consequences of these understory species are on our ecosystem. And again, Japanese stiltgrass is one of the most common understory invaders. This is a common site I'm sure most of you are familiar with in our forest understories. But there's also one that I'm mentioning here is wavy leaf basket grass. I'm not going to show you data on that, but I'm certain that many of you are aware of this species. It is super common in Eastern Maryland, where it was first introduced, I think maybe 15, 20 years ago. And it's sort of the way I like to think about it is like the worst perennial brother of Japanese stiltgrass. Like if you think Japanese stiltgrass is bad, wavy leaf basket grass is even worse. Um, it has this really interesting way of dispersing that the fruits of this grass have a sticky substance that are on the ends of the awns that can attach to pets or wildlife or hunters or hikers. And as they're moving around, they disperse really readily. And so, we did some work in Maryland where it looked like this scene, but it was a mix of Japanese stiltgrass and wavy leaf basket grass sort of intertwined with each other. And so I know there's a lot of concern about that species spreading further, and I think that concern is certainly justified. And so, one of the things we were interested in was what sort of the sort of collective ecological impact of Japanese stiltgrass. And so I had a PhD student a number of years ago where um, we we wanted to compare what happened in an invaded system, so where Japanese stiltgrass is dominant, to places where is nearby, but Japanese stiltgrass has not yet invaded. So you can think about it as that like that the before system. And then a third scenario was what happens if we remove Japanese stiltgrass where it's not able to sort of grow throughout the growing season, where we hand remove it. And sort of what you can see there is a plot of where we're removing the border, and then we've hand weeded the whole bit. So like grad students earn their stay here with hand weeding the forest, which was no joke. But the what we were interested in is one of the motivations for removing invasive species is that the ecosystem will heal, if you will. It'll return back to its uninvaded state, and the ecological processes will rebound following removal. And so I'm going to show you a little bit of a complicated graph, but I want to simplify it to show you those are our three. So think about those three circles as the three treatments, right? So on the bottom right is the uninvaded. So we measured all kinds of processes, nutrients, native species, microbial processes, a whole bunch of different things. And we use this complicated statistical process to sort of combine them all together. And what you see is that an uninvaded ecosystem exists sort of on the bottom right there. It's very different than on the left, which shows you the invaded system where Japanese stiltgrass has been present for a long time. And basically, those two systems are 100% different. They do not behave like each other at all. They are very unique ecological processes. But you also notice that once we removed it, and we removed it for 3 years, on the top right there, you can see that the removed system is getting closer back to the uninvaded state, but it's still 80% different. So even after 3 years of management, where there was never Japanese stiltgrass in an established form, the ecosystem was healing, if you will, but it didn't sort of return back to that uninvaded state. So there's a lot to unpack there. It does suggest that management is useful and working, but we shouldn't necessarily assume that, at least in the short term, that ecosystems just sort of rebound automatically back to the way that they were used to functioning previously. So just it's sort of a picture on sort of how our local ecosystems are functioning. Okay, so where do these things come from? I really like this quote because it looks like it's out of the Bible, like, you know, a Genesis book of like, in the beginning there were no weeds, right? The point of this is that humans are involved in this. There's not naturally an invasive species, right? Humans play a very intentional role here, and we interact with this in sort of two ways. There's the intentional bit, which you know, is involved in we're moving them around because they're beautiful or useful or tasty or have medicinal properties. A whole range of reasons that we intentionally move things around. That's one pathway by which these species move around. And the other is accidental, where they're just coming along, hitchhiking in some way that we didn't intend, but is a direct result of some process. And I have a picture there showing the ship ballast. And, you know, as you're aware, as ships move across the world, as they take on cargo or release cargo, they need to take on ballast to keep the ship steady in the ocean. And the way they did that historically was they would take rocks and soil from the port of Spain, and then they would get to Boston and they would unload that stuff. And so a lot of introduced plant species were brought in that way in the early days. They subsequently moved to water, which was had a whole bunch of benefits, but it turns out there's stuff that lives in the marine ecosystems that can survive that trip. And that was a huge problem of moving around marine species from port to port. So they've since fixed that problem where now most cargo ships by treaty have to go mid-ocean, swish around their tanks and spit it out because that ocean water is saltier than the coast. And so it's become a pretty effective biocide for removing invasive species that way. But to come back to this, you know, when you're being moved by humans, it often means you're closely associated with us in some way. You know, we like you, we find you beautiful, you do something for us, and we want to pick you up and move you long distances. And we have a long, long history of doing that, again, for very noble reasons. But even though we've know a lot about invasive species, you can still go to this unnamed big box store, no idea which one it is, where I took these pictures of recently of known invasive species available for sale. And this is what drives me absolutely crazy is we know these things are problematic. They Yet we can still buy them, plant them in our yards. I know there's a lot of groups here in Virginia working really hard to solve this problem, and we're making progress, but there's still a long way to go. And I think this is like the simplest solution for mitigating future invasive problems is number one, not if they're going to remain for sale, at least educate yourself and not buy these things and plant them in your property. We have really good resources on the known invasive plant species of the state. Um, and so, you know, that's the role that we can all play is educating ourselves and our neighbors. I've been slowly sort of moving my own ornamental plants in my yard more and more to native alternatives. And it's not to say you have to go all native. There are, you know, introduced species that are perfectly safe, but anyway, this remains the primary pathway by which many invasive plants are introduced. And you know, the most of our invasive plant species, again, follow this pathway. So, you know, thinking about that is as one of the things that we can all be involved in. Okay, a question I get asked all the time is, what makes some introduced species invasive? You know, there's this common idea that only a very small percentage of introduced species become invasive problems. And so what is it that's different between that smaller proportion of invasive ones? And I'm just going to give you one explanation. There are lots and lots of explanations, but there's one that is most commonly used that I think best captures and sort of simplifies this. And you'll have to pardon my 1980s references here with Super Mario Brothers. But The idea is that in an organism's native range, there are a wide range of things that eat it and make it sick, that keep its populations in check. And they've evolved over a very long time to have this relationship. There's not enough pests to eliminate the species, and the species has enough defenses to protect itself. But when you pull that species out of its native range and move it a long distance where it's unlikely to have those same organisms present, it sort of releases it from its need um, to defend itself. And to sort of simplify that from a plant's perspective, plants have to make all kinds of things. They only have so many resources available to them, and they have to allocate those limited resources to different parts of their anatomy, to their structures, and to defenses, right? So if we take the sort of piranha bite there at the top is defenses. So in its native range, it has to spend some of its resources defending itself against those native predators and pests. And so that's what it sort of looks like in the native range. But if you move it out of that pressure, they actually are capable of evolving to diminish the amount of resources they need to protect themselves, which they can reallocate then to grow larger, faster, and produce more offspring. So this is the generally accepted, most common explanation for how is it that these species are able to reproduce and spread so well outside of their native range. Again, this is not the sole explanation, and this is not always the explanation, but this is a general rule of thumb. And the sort of caveat here too is that it's mostly for specialist predators and herbivores. A lot of times generalists can adapt, but anyway, that's the general idea. If we think about that from a management perspective, we often can use that to our advantage through biological control, right? That's the whole premise of biocontrol, is that we go find those specialist um, predators or herbivores and we reunite them with that invasive species. But we don't have a lot of tools actually for invasive species management, at least like relative to our agricultural peers who have a lot more tools in the toolbox for managing weeds and agro ecosystems. And I love this picture in the inset showing how spongy moth, previously gypsy moth, was being managed back in the day, like sending people up in trees pulling off egg masses. Like, whoa, that was the like cutting edge technology in the 1800s. We don't do that anymore for obvious reasons, but we don't have a lot of tools, and you can see on the right there that the types of tools and success available to us as something becomes more common and established actually diminish quite a bit. And so, we think about prevention is absolutely the best tool in our toolbox and something I've worked a lot on. And really, we often don't notice something becoming problematic until it's pretty common. So, developing new management or mitigation tools is something that, we still need a lot of investment in. But when I first got here a long time ago, I was thinking, you know what, I want to try to see if we can eradicate Japanese stiltgrass. Like, I'm a new faculty member. Um, let's go do this. How can we get rid of this thing? So I work with some colleagues and we created a 10-year project where we were going to evaluate some different programs on either using herbicides, different kinds of herbicides, mechanical techniques for if we went to the same plot of land 10 years in a row, we never let a Japanese stiltgrass flower and set seed, could we actually get rid of it? And so this is what a sort of plot would look like. They were pretty big plots. That's a before picture. That's an after picture. We'd selectively remove Japanese stiltgrass. And I am unhappy to report we never got rid of it. After 10 years of dedicated work where we never let that thing go to seed, it still was able to come back from the seed bank in all of our treatments. So 10 years was not enough to get rid of this species. Um, to make matters worse, some of our treatments had pretty negative um, detrimental consequences to desirable native species, just as an unintended consequence of spraying herbicides or weed eating out in the forest. And that last bit of called this weed-shaped hole is something that I like that term because there's a pretty consistent phenomenon that when you remove one invasive plant, what you've done is you've opened up an area that what does it get colonized by? Unfortunately, it's not native species that we care about. It's often some other invasive species. So when you think about invasive plant management in combination with restoration, I think is a much more effective goal. Okay, so I'm going to end on some additional bad news because I feel like all I do is ever give bad news, and which is too bad. But we'll give you a little bit of bright spots at the very end. The One of the sort of paradoxes or challenges with invasive species is that they often take a long time to manifest. In other words, the things that we know as invasive now were often introduced decades to centuries ago. And the number of new species that are being introduced across the world, across different taxonomic groups, continues to exponentially increase. And there's an estimated 200 new introduced species moved around the world every year that establish. So the sort of invaders of my kids' generation is going to look very different than what I'm dealing with now because it takes time for these things to change. And so the number of new species, again, this sort of global mixing is going to continue to ramp up. And climate change, of course, that's the wild card here that's going to make everything unpredictable. But there are a few things that we know. This is, as someone who's extraordinarily allergic to poison ivy, this is like worst case scenario. Is there's pretty interesting research showing that under climate change conditions, poison ivy grows larger. It produces more of the allergenic compound, and the more toxic, if you will, forms of that allergenic compound. So I may never go outside again in a few decades because like just walking outside, I'm going to get poison ivy. So that's some bad news. And there's also been some research showing that the tools that we use to manage our invasive plants are likely to not work as well. There's been some research showing that under increased CO2 conditions, a rate of herbicide that would normally work to kill agricultural weeds no longer kills them, which may have the consequence that we need to use different products or more of those products because the weeds are able to compensate and metabolize the products that are available to us now. This is a little bit of a young field now, but I just wanted to sort of paint that picture that there's some, uh, we may be facing, an enhanced challenge of just trying to manage these things. And of course, climate change is likely to move things around. I just want to give one example here that's of increasing concern in Virginia. The red imported fire ant. We've got a couple of folks here on campus working on fire ants. And the picture on the left there is showing what happens to a fire ant colony after flooding. Those are all fire ants that got together and made their own flotilla that they can spread in these high water events. And there's, they're spreading a lot in southeastern Virginia. And I know there's a reporting program at VDAX. So, again, this is just one example of how invasive species are likely to be shifting their distributions in response to climate change. So the stuff that's problematic now in Virginia may be moving north, and we may be inheriting the invasive species of our southern counterparts. And the real sort of challenge here is that when these things become established, they're pretty much there forever on a large scale. We're able to have success stories on a smaller scale, but really think focusing on prevention is really time and energy and capital well spent. So again, thinking about making small incremental progress. I don't mean to share this to be a defeatist, because I don't think we should be defeatist. I think we should be thinking about taking active roles in education and prevention and management, but it does serve as a cautionary tale that if we don't do anything, it's likely to become a problem forever. And I want to end with some statistics from this IPBES report that I referenced at the beginning, and to give you a sort of state of invasive species globally. Again, there's about 37,000 established introduced species. So the global community uses the term alien. We do not use that term typically in the US, but I'm just using the global language here. Again, about 200 new species are being recorded every year somewhere in the globe, and that's probably an underestimate because we often don't know them until they're established and widespread. That's the sort of estimated number of problematic invasive species. And again, I'm confident that number is grossly underestimated because we just don't have enough people doing the research on it. Oftentimes they sort of assume that these species are having impacts without knowledge of that information. So that's probably an underestimate. I thought this one was pretty interesting, is that about a third of known species have only been reported, in my lifetime. So, again, a lot of these were introduced a really long time ago, and so there's going to be generational change, and that number is likely to increase exponentially through global trade, et cetera. So the anticipated increase in a couple decades of business as usual is likely to be massive. So the all of these impacts and problems that these species are likely to cause is likely to be much worse in the future. Assuming we don't do anything, and we're very much hoping that collectively we all do something. And that's where I want to end on just sort of making you familiar with the Invasive Species Collaborative. So I serve as director of this group. We started as a working group here on campus in 2016. We competed for some large internal funding from Virginia Tech a couple years ago, called a destination area. It was a competitive process, and we actually won this competition. And what that came with is we have some funding to support us as a group. We now have over 50 people here on campus working on invasive species in some capacity, all taxonomic groups, social sciences. We have artists, philosophers, all working on this problem. But we also have the opportunity where we're hiring 7 brand new tenure track faculty across 4 different colleges on campus, all working on invasive species. And so once these folks are hired about a year from now, when we're finished, Virginia Tech, and I say without too much hyperbole, is likely to have the greatest depth and breadth of invasive species expertise of any organization in the United States, perhaps the world. So I'm really hopeful that we can, be leaders in this space and, make important progress on it. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Barney. I also wanted to second his comments about the Invasive Species Collaborative. I do have the opportunity to interact with some of the faculty that are either in the ISC already or part of those cluster hires, some of those new faculty, and I've been very, very impressed with the work that's happening, and I'm very happy to be a part of it. Also the Extension Master Gardener program. We talked to Hallie a week or two ago, and so the Extension Master Gardener program in Virginia is I don't remember the exact term or title, but I want to say like a member organization. Is that the
Yes, that's right. So we've got partner programs as well. So if your organization is interested in partnering with the ISC, you can reach out to me or through Grace, and we can chat. We're really trying to make some deep connections in the state because it's really going to take all of us to work together. And so, if you want help through talks or visits, et cetera, reach out. We're happy to make that connection.
Yeah, we have some really, really great speakers and a lot of people involved. So there's some questions in the chat.
Okay.
I'll go ahead and address one of them. There is going to be a recording of this available on the EMG program webinar site. So if you want to go watch through, pause, take notes, that's good. Additionally, if there's a desire for it, I can probably link to some of the papers where some of these figures are from. If you guys are like me and you want to digest the literature, some of those I think were in Dr. Barney. You had us read those in your invasion biology class, and those were so that was a really good class. If you have the opportunity to take classes on campus, sign up for Dr. Barney's invasion biology class. That
And
was
I can
good.
share the slides too, Grace, if you want. I can send those to you if you're interested.
Yeah, send those to me and we'll link it on our intranet. There's a question about experts on calorie pair. I would probably say DOF for that. They have some really good information on, there are some exchange programs still. I think Montgomery County and Blacksburg had one recently.
Hmm.
There might have been one on the coast recently. Otherwise, so check out DOF. Also, there's a question about faster listing of state invasive species, especially removal of the removal of things on the current marketplace and things like that. And so I know that we've talked about invasive species in terms of theory and stuff, but I'm hoping you'd be able to talk a little bit about the different lists for invasive
Yeah.
species and the process for that, and why we don't why things are maybe not as fast as we might feel they should be. And then after you answer that, I can probably give a little bit of information for our extension volunteers about what your role can and should be in that.
Yeah,
Because
happy
I'm still
to.
extension representative. So, but Dr. Barney is a great person to answer that question.
So okay, so there's two, I'm just going to talk about plants for the moment. So there's two lists with respect to plants in the state. One is the noxious weed list, which if you Google Virginia noxious weed list, that's the list of regulated plant species. And so that those are plants that have gone through a vetting process that any citizen, anyone in the state can propose a plant to be listed as a noxious weed. And that has the benefit of making it illegal to buy, sell, or transport that species within the state. So that works really well for, in my mind, things that may be in small populations or not quite here yet that we don't want in Virginia. So that's a regulatory process. Um, Again, you'd fill out this, it's a web form that gets filtered to VDAX, and then VDAX presents that to a noxious weed advisory committee, of which I serve as a panelist. And there's about a dozen of us, and we discuss those species for proposal in the regulation. And because it's in a regulation, it takes about 2 years or so from the time that plant is proposed to when it is actually regulated. So it grinds as slow as government, and there's nothing we can do about that, unfortunately. But it is a democratic process. Anybody can do it. But there's one caveat here that's a little bit frustrating, is that if that plant species has commercial viability in the state of Virginia, it is ineligible from being on considered a noxious weed. So if you can buy it, we can't list it. So that's a hiccup or sort of a hurdle, if you will, to getting broad listing. We'll never get barberry or some of these other species that are currently for sale. So so what does that leave us with? That leaves us with a second list, which is the invasive plant species of Virginia, which is a non-regulatory list that's maintained by the Natural Heritage Program within DCR. Now that gets updated every 2 years according to the Virginia Invasive Species Management Plan. And that is just for educational purposes. It has no regulatory authority, but it allows you to educate yourself as to what species are known problems here in Virginia. And it's a great thing to just check when you're at a home center and you're not, maybe you're unfamiliar with that species and you want a quick check on it. Uh, the there was a bill that was in the General Assembly requiring um, uh, places that sell plants to label these as invasive, and that got killed. So that's currently not going to happen. But I do believe it is now law that installers have to inform their customers about plants that they may be putting into their yard, for example, that maybe are known invasive species. So this is where self-education is going to work way faster than the gears of government. But if you want to see those things change, contact the folks in government to make that. Blue Ridge Prism I saw came up in the chat. They are amazing folks. We work really closely with them. They are working really hard to advance this in the General Assembly at the state level, and they have a fantastic website with all kinds of resources as well. So those are the lists that exist in the state.
Yeah, and so I wanted to, thank you. I wanted to address something. We get a lot of comments from our master gardeners asking us or coordinators seeking advice about how to interact with um point of sales that sell invasives. And part of the reason I wanted to have Dr. Barney on to explain that the different lists and those things is because it is, as an extension master gardener, you're representing cooperative extension, and those businesses that sell plants, they probably don't just sell invasives, they sell other things and they contribute to local economies and things like that. So it's not in extension's best interest to have the volunteers going around and I don't want to use the word harassing, but confronting local businesses about the plants that they sell. I think it's appropriate to have those conversations with a local business, or leave that up to your extension agent to have that conversation or bring it up. But it's extension to some degree serves those businesses as landscaping businesses and as landscapers, landscaping businesses, wholesale nurseries, all of those people are equally entitled to extension support as volunteers and homeowners are. And so even though they might not be doing the things that we want them to do, our role is an education role. And so we shouldn't be secret shoppers and checking and seeing who's selling what. We should just be like, oh, I don't think I should buy that. And not maybe not having those at our plant sales for our Extension Master Gardener program. But I wanted to make sure you guys understood what goes into making those lists and how our role in using those lists is more of an educational role. There are authorities out there like VDACs that do some level of enforcement for the noxious weeds list. And there's a lot of work that goes into that. So I wanted to clear that up because I've been on some email chains recently. Um, there, there's a question from Lori about do landscapers have to inform clients about just invasive plants or having to inform them about non-native plants? So maybe, Jacob, could you answer
Yeah.
answer that
S-
one?
So my knowledge is that the it's limited to plants on that invasive plant list. So because again, that non-native does not equal they're invasive. They're not the same thing. And so my understanding is that that's limited to those species on that known invasive plant list.
And I want to say that not everything that is not native is necessarily bad. And I know that
Yeah.
there's always a caveat of like yet, right? And I know that that's the concern is like, well, if it's native, it's always going to be um good for our area, but it might also not always be able to survive. If we have anybody in the Northern Virginia region, or like in some of our more urban areas, some of your native species may not survive in your area because the process of urbanizing the area has changed your soil, it's changed your temperature, your USDA hardiness zone may have changed, water, all of those things may have changed. So there might be a, excuse me, a better option than your native plant.
Grace mentioned hardiness zones, and I was just teaching class this morning about climate change and weeds. And the hardiness zone here in Blacksburg has changed in the 15 years I've been here. So I think, those of us living in that elevation are likely to see that change, um, unfortunately, faster than perhaps other places.
Sorry, I'm recovering from a cold.
No
Um,
problem.
does anybody else have questions? If you want to put them in the chat, we have time for maybe one more.
I'm going to put a link to our invasive species group in the chat just so you guys have access to our resources. So that's the link to the Invasive Species Collaborative for those of you interested. Please feel free to reach out.
Okay, if we don't have any more questions, we are going to end the webinar. There's going to be some links on the EMG webinar archive, some of the stuff that we've talked about. Probably look for that in the next week or so. And everybody, big thank you to Dr. Barney for joining us. This was fantastic. It was exactly what we were looking for.
Perfect. Thanks for having me, Grace. Appreciate it. And thanks to all you out there. Good luck with everything.
Yeah, and sign on to see Gabrielle in 2 weeks.
Oh yeah, let me give a brief shout out. So Gabrielle is one of my PhD students, and she's doing really awesome work in urban restored streams, and she's got some interesting data on how restoration is impacting invasive species and the way places sound in response to invasion and restoration. So check that out.
Awesome. Thank you guys. Everybody have a wonderful week.